It's wonderful to see this awesome crowd here tonight. I'm Paul Fanland, and on behalf of all of us at the Capital Times, I'd like to welcome you to this special session, which is part of our 7th annual Cap Times Idea Fest. I want to begin by thanking everyone in the room for your support of the Capital Times and our independent local journalism. While we appreciate all of our readers, I know the special commitment you made tonight to create this sellout for us, and we really appreciate it. I'm going to start by thanking our sponsors. This year, again, Epic Systems is our presenting sponsor, HealthX Ventures and Exact Sciences are our major sponsors, and our other sponsors, thank you. We couldn't do this without them, that's for sure. Other sponsors include Madison Gas and Electric, Alliant Energy, Ascendium Education Group, the University of Wisconsin-Madison with this great space, Godfrey Kahn Law, Kessenix, the University Research Park, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Cargo Coffee, Leopold's Books, Bar, Cafe, the Madison Community Foundation, Madison College Forward Theater, and Youngblood Beer Company. Give them a round of applause, I'd appreciate it, thank you. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, and Civic Media. And I wanted to take a second to shout out to the PBS Wisconsin folks here tonight and the Director of Television, John Mishkowski, who has a big contingent here for the appearance of Judy Woodruff. So thank you for all your support and being here. As many of you know, William T. Evu founded the Capital Times in 1917 as a voice for progressive opinion and revelatory journalism. Since Mr. Evu's passing more than 5 decades ago, his Evu Foundation has contributed more than $70 million back to this community for an awful lot of worthy causes most of you know all about. If you're not already, and I suspect many of you are, I'd love you to consider becoming a Cap Times member. This is the 2nd year for this special journalism fundraiser event. Many of you were here a year ago to hear David Maraniss talk with legendary journalist Carl Bernstein. This year, David will talk with legendary journalism couple, Judy Woodruff and Al Hunt. David, of course, is a legend in his own right, as most of you know. A Madison West graduate who stays connected to Madison, to the Cap Times, and the Cap Times where his father was once the editor and led us. His guests tonight are familiar names to anyone who has followed national politics over the decades. Judy Woodruff hosted the PBS NewsHour until last winter with an even-handed approach that distinguished her in the cacophony of broadcast media today. She remains a senior PBS correspondent and is devoting this year and next to a national reporting project titled Judy Woodruff Presents America at a Crossroads, exploring the bitter divisions in America today. I've watched several of these episodes, and they're brilliant. We were talking about them before we came in here, and I'd recommend them to you. Judy covered politics and other news for nearly 5 decades at NBC, CNN, and PBS. Al is best known for his work over 35 years in the Washington Bureau of the Wall Street Journal. He was a Bloomberg opinion columnist after that on politics and policy, and clearly from the conversations we were having, he's as engaged as he's ever been in the national political terrain. He's also a familiar face, or has been a familiar face, on national television over time, on NBC's Meet the Press, PBS's Washington Week in Review, CNN's Capitol Gang, and as a political analyst for the CBS Morning News. As we were setting up this event, David told me how much he appreciated Judy's skilled interviews when he appeared on the NewsHour to talk about his latest political book, which of course you all know has been plentiful. And how he occasionally runs into Al at a neighborhood coffee shop in their Washington, D.C. neighborhood where they discuss the state of the world. Well, we're thrilled to have all 3 of them in Madison tonight. Please welcome them.
this on? Great. Well, a little hard fall there. I want to repeat what Paul said about the importance of local journalism, and thank you all for supporting local journalism by being here tonight. I'm a product of local journalism. The fact that I'm here tonight is because of that. In 1957, my family moved to Madison when the Capital Times was the one newspaper in the country that would hire my father. And really, as I've said every time and will continue saying, that newspaper in this city saved my dad and my family, and I'm trying to pay it back every time I can. Al doesn't know this, but I sort of have a secret knowledge of him that I could only get because they lived in our neighborhood, and I would see him out our front window. And that is that he is perhaps the slowest jogger in the world. And Al, I can say that because I don't jog. I'm even slower, and I'm the slowest walker in the world. Of course, I love the comment that the editor of The Atlantic made about Judy, which is that she's the last grown-up journalist in Washington, which is so true. The sort of title that I gave this is Living with the News, and there actually is news that I want to start with. And that involves two figures who couldn't be more unalike, Newt Minnow and Rupert Murdoch. Last night, Judy and Al were at the memorial honoring Newton Minnow, who, for those of you who don't know, is from Milwaukee, spent his life in Chicago, died at age 97 after a brilliant career. And the key to the connection between Minnow and Murdoch is that it was Newt Minnow who coined the phrase of television as the vast wasteland. And this was decades before Rupert Murdoch came along. But I know that Judy had a special relationship with Newt, and I thought we could start with you talking about last night and all of that.
Thank you, David. But the first thing I have to say is what a thrill it is for Al and me to be back in Madison. We love this city. We love Wisconsin. So we were incredibly honored, and when David reached out to ask if we would consider doing this, I don't think we even blinked an eye, and we immediately said yes, because, as everyone here knows, David Maraniss is a national treasure. I'm using this prerogative, David, because you are the reporter's reporter. You not content to have just won a Pulitzer Prize for his work. He went on to write, is it 15 or 16 books?
Not quite, but close.
Sorry.
13.
15.
Working on 14.
A lot of them. But he just keeps on going and sets the gold standard, sets the standard for all of us in journalism. So I want to salute you once again, the one and only David Maraniss. Thank you very much. Thank you. And David, you ask about, I mean, what a remarkable juxtaposition you just pointed out. Newt Minnow, as you said, from Milwaukee, who went on to become one of the great public servants of our time, died this past May at the age of 97. My path crossed with him because of his role in, frankly, the creation of public broadcasting. After President John Kennedy asked him to serve as the head of the the first head of the Federal Communication Commission, he did go on to take that role very seriously, examined what television was doing, and this was the early 1960s. Took a look, and he gave that speech, which has gone down in history. He liked, Mr. Minnow used to like to say that there was much more about the speech that he wanted people to notice, but it was that vast wasteland line that caught everyone's attention, and it was part of the reason for the genesis of public broadcasting. So he went on to become, for someone who served just a few years in public life, he served at the FCC, then went on to be a lawyer in private practice, but served on the Presidential Debate Commission, and in so many other ways, his influence was such an important mentor to President Obama, to other Democrats, and leading figures in our country. So Al and I were privileged to know him, and we were incredibly privileged to be at that service yesterday, where his 3 daughters, who are all remarkable individuals, one of them, Martha, she was the dean of the Harvard Law School, Nell, who is an expert in corporate governance and has become a renowned movie critic, and then his daughter Mary is one of the leading librarians in the nation. So it was just a privilege for us to be there with that, to remember Newt Minnow.
And Judy might not say it, but Newt Minnow loved her so much that only a few days before he died, at age 97, he hosted a dinner for Judy to honor her.
It was just another example of the person he was, active until the very last minute, and what a tribute to Milwaukee and his roots here.
So now today we have the news of Rupert Murdoch stepping away, whatever. And I'm curious, Al, after watching that newspaper part of his empire for so long, what you think this means, what Murdoch's, what you think his legacy is, but also how this might change the newspapers and Fox News, if it does, and for the better or worse.
Well, it's the perfect, can you guys hear me? He's the perfect antidote to Newton Minnow. I mean, he's the anti-Newton Minnow. He's obviously brilliant. He's been incredibly successful, whether it's Australia, the UK, or America. But he has really produced a Gresham's law of news, where the bad drives out the good. And I think that's his legacy. When you think of anything that the Murdoch papers have done, I will say this: I worked at the Wall Street Journal for many years, and when he took it over, I dreaded that. And it's been much better than I thought it was going to be. It's still a good paper, and the editorial page is still as crazy as it's always been. So therefore, that really hasn't changed much. But I don't think Murdoch's departure is going to matter a whole lot, David, because his son's taking over, who's just has the same view. They're about the bottom line. And I think it's been he's been a real detriment to American journalism. And
is it possible that it could get worse under his son?
It is. I mean, there are. Well, first of all, as I say, the Wall Street Journal, which I think is the crown jewel of his newspapers, could certainly. I thought it really would turn into a propaganda sheet. It would be like a upscale New York Post, if that's not an oxymoron. But I have problem when they did a obituary of Ted Kennedy. The leading quote was from Rush Limbaugh, and I thought, oh, well, that's Murdoch. But I still think the paper does a lot of good journalism.
Oh, I agree, but maybe some in the audience don't realize that there's a literal wall at the Washington Post and at the Wall Street Journal between the editorial section and the news section.
Totally.
And that's what saved a lot of great reporters came out of the Wall Street Journal.
Right, and that's the way it should be at papers, I think. But, I will say, I will add to what Judy said about David Maraniss. But I have reason to be intimidated by this, because I checked with an expert. And that expert, I said I was going to be interviewed by David Maraniss, and that expert said, you ought to be intimidated because my grandpa has a way with words. So,
this is a wonderful story. Our oldest granddaughter, Heidi, is a freshman at Wake Forest, where Al is a big shot on the board and was there in its earliest days. And he's been very nice to Heidi. Thank you very much.
And her grandpa does have a way with words.
There's so many important, deeper issues to talk about, but I thought it'd be good for the audience to sort of get to know you both a little bit more. Judy, I know that you've called yourself a military brat. Is there any kid who came from the military who's not a brat? I mean, that's so. But anyway, and ended up in Augusta, Georgia, right? But what drew you to journalism? What was the spark?
Well, I did, as you say, David, I did grow up, and I think, the brat is actually a good thing. It means that you stood up for yourself when you were growing up. But I did grow up. I was born in Tulsa, Moved to Germany as a little girl at the age of 5, where my father was sent there with the military, and then we came back to the United States. We were in Missouri, New Jersey, Oklahoma again, then to Taiwan for a few years, and then I was in North Carolina, and then high school in Augusta, Georgia. But I think that moving around probably in the end led me to journalism. But I will tell you that because of my generation, I graduated from high school in 1964. My mother hadn't finished high school herself. She had barely finished 10th grade. She hadn't had the educational opportunities I had, and she always encouraged me. She said, whatever you do, get that education. Diapers and dishes can wait, and that was in my head. But having said that, what was I going to do with it? And I turned to some of the teachers who I was the closest to. They advised me to go into math because I did like math and was decent at it. But once I got to college and started taking a course in calculus, encountered a professor who frankly didn't think women should be taking advanced math.
You're the first journalist I've ever heard who liked math. Am I right, Al?
I could
Absolutely. And could do it.
No, somebody said, what are you going to do with it? And they said, you could be an insurance actuary. And I don't know if there are any of you in the room who are insurance. Okay, all right, good deal. But long story short, I had a professor who was really good at political science. I switched my major, fell in love with covering politics, worked in Washington for 2 years for my congressman. This is, again, by then it's the late 60s. And one of the women I met on Capitol Hill said, you don't want to work in Washington after college because you'll be the coffee girl. You'll be the gopher. So I went back to Duke my senior year, and I went to a professor for advice, and he said, did you ever think about covering politics? Think about journalism. And so I fell into it, was hired as the newsroom secretary, so I was the coffee girl in a television newsroom, but fell in love with it, and that's where I was determined to stay ever since. That was 1968. And I haven't looked away since. I feel like I'm the luckiest person in American journalism.
That's wonderful. And of course, you did have to overcome a lot of sexist stereotypes in the early days, right?
Well, that news director who hired me to be the newsroom secretary, I was on spring break from college, my senior year, spring semester, spring break, and we sat in the lobby of the ABC affiliate station in Atlanta, where we had this long conversation about why was I interested in journalism and what had I studied, and he was interested that I was taking a year of Russian. Not that I could do anything with it in Atlanta, but it nevertheless. And I got up to leave, and he said, okay, you have the job, you can be the newsroom secretary, answer the phone, take dictation, and clean the film. And I was thrilled to have it. And I got up, I said, Mr. Conover, thank you so much. And he said, besides, how could I not hire somebody with legs like yours? So math, politics, journalism, it was 1968, and that was the environment. And, thankfully, times have changed. Times have changed.
Thankfully, yes. And Al, you grew up in the Philly suburbs, is that right?
I did.
And then went south for college?
I did. My father was a pediatrician who I adored, but anyone here have a pediatrician as a relative or a parent or anything? Because if you're the son or daughter of a pediatrician, there are two things you know. Number one, you are loved, and number two, you are medically not cared for at all. So I was a bit of a rebel, and that's why I went to school down south, David. And it was very simple the way I got in journalism. I got kicked out of college. I got kicked out of college for throwing
That sounds familiar.
What was a wild party back then. By today's standards, these kids would just laugh at it. And I went home. My best friend's editor was the city editor of the Philadelphia Bulletin.
Put it up a little higher.
Am I here? Can you hear?
Yeah, it's better.
My best friend's dad was the city editor of the Philadelphia Bulletin, and I went to tell him I'd been thrown out of college. My father wasn't terribly pleased. And he said, why don't you come to work for the Bulletin as a copy boy? This is an evening newspaper back in 1962. Or 3, and I said something to the effect of, isn't that a little bit beneath my dignity? And he kind of looked at my situation, and I started the next morning, and I just fell in love with it. I mean, it was just great. And about 4 or 5 months, I was only out of college for 6 months. About 4 or 5 months later, he, being a lot of hard work, diligence, perseverance, and being a dear friend of the city editor, I got promoted to nightside reporter. And David, I still remember the first story I ever wrote. It was about Florence Hay. And Florence Hay was 83. She died. So I was writing an obituary. And I was a little bit condescending about this being my calling in journalism. And this city editor, a wonderful man named Earl Selby, came by and looked at me and said, let me tell you something. If you make one mistake in that piece, you get one age wrong, you get one initial wrong, you get one spelling wrong, everyone in that family and that acquaintance will not forgive the Philadelphia Bulletins. So damn it, you better hate to make a mistake. You may make them, but you got to hate it if you do. I don't think I've ever gotten a better lesson in my life. So Florence Hay lives in my mind forever.
One more story about the two of you before we get on to issues, and that is sort of the origin story of the Woodruff Hunt relationship. I'm sure there's a true story and a mythological story. And I'm sure, knowing the two of you, that Judy probably tells the true story, and Al, the mythological
Mine's better,
story.
though.
So which one do you want to start with, the myth or the truth?
Well, I will start. I think the true and the mythology, although Al will, I'm sure, embroider in some way. I was covering, you know, fast forward, I mentioned being hired as a newsroom secretary. I did that for a year and a half and then was hired by another station in Atlanta, the CBS station, to be a reporter. Did that for 5 years. The person who was governor for most of that time happened to be a former peanut farmer from South Georgia named Jimmy Carter. So he was governor. He went on to run for president at exactly the same time I was trying to be hired by a network. Managed to get hired by NBC. After first being told, forget it and come back in a few years, they called me up and said, we just fired somebody. Could you send us another resume? One of those stories. So there I was working for NBC, brand new, after at first saying Jimmy Carter's going nowhere, we don't care about him. They finally said, okay, you can spend some time on the trail following Jimmy Carter. I was with the press corps in Plains, Georgia in the summer of 1976. This was around the time he had won some primaries. He was on his way to winning the nomination. And Jimmy Carter loved to put these softball games together between the Carter staff with the great help of the Secret Service agents, who were all, of course, in great shape, and they never lost a game against the press corps. So we always lost, but we kept coming back for more punishment. So it was one of those games. It was a hot, I think, July afternoon. Al will embellish this. I was on second base, and I was covering for Carter. Al was visiting from one campaign, not visiting, he was covering one campaign to another, and he was in center field, just came over and introduced himself and said, I'm Al Hunt. And, the rest is history.
She, of course, leaves out. She leaves out the initial time that I encountered Judy Woodruff, which was in Steubenville, Ohio, in late May of 1976. And I was the national political reporter for the Wall Street Journal, so I was hopping from primary. And in those days, Ohio, California, New Jersey had the last primary. So I was on my last day of spending a couple days in Ohio, and we were in Carter was in Steubenville, and they set up these rectangular phone booths that you would go in, and there would be a big partition, so you couldn't see the person that was next to you. And I was calling my office arguing about a story that should run the next day, and the editor was resisting, and I really felt strongly about it. And suddenly I noticed, now, this is the story, so it's not, please understand, this is not as sexist as it sounds.
Yes, it is.
I noticed all I could see was next to me were a pair of legs and a press badge, which told me that those legs probably belonged to the press corps. So this person left and went around the other way, and I never saw who it was. And so I dashed onto the press bus, and there was Sam Donaldson, and I saw the person who had been next to me, and I said, now forgive me, okay? This is 1976. I said to Sam, who is the blonde with the great legs? And he said, that's Judy Woodruff. And so I developed a crush for not the right reasons, and later I developed a crust for the right reasons, which I have persisted to this day.
And Judy, do you forgive him for that?
Well, I don't know. I wanted him to say, there was this brainy reporter, who was covering Jimmy Carter for NBC. No.
Right. So for those of you who don't watch PBS, and I presume this is a PBS crowd, for the last year, Judy has been doing, or the last several months, Judy's been doing these wonderful longer pieces since she left the anchor desk. Traveling around America, studying the divide. And one of those issues in particular is related to what we're here for tonight, which is the troubles, the demise of local journalism. Can you talk about where you went and what you found in doing that story?
Well, I will. And David, I have to say, we started our reporting early this year in February, and the first place we went to report was right here in Wisconsin, because we focused on your state Supreme
That's my next
Court.
question after
Okay,
this
and
one.
I'll stay away from that. Okay, stay away from that. Thank you for the warning. The project came about last year as I thought about, I'm going to be stepping away from anchoring, which is something that had been in the works for a long time. I knew I wanted to continue reporting, and the one thing that kept coming back to me was how this country is so divided, how the American people today just seem more divided than we've been at any time in the 50 years I've been covering American politics. And I wanted to try to understand it better. I've been at the anchor desk the last 11 years at the NewsHour, and then a little hiatus, and then I was at CNN before that. Jim Lehrer used to say that I was wandering in the wilderness of cable television. But at 12 years at CNN, so I spent a lot of time behind the desk, if you will, and I really wanted to get out in the country. And so I proposed the idea to my executive producer and others, and everybody agreed that it was something that we needed to do. And so we did start, David, early this year, traveling around America, trying to understand in as many states as we can get to over this 2-year period of what's at the base of this. And we've been to Pennsylvania, looking at trying to understand local school boards that used to be these sleepy, quiet occasions. They're now bitterly fighting and divided over banning books and what should be taught in school and who should be allowed to participate in athletics, to what you mentioned, David, which is the terrible collapse of local journalism. And why is that part of the division? It's because we now know that when local news goes away, when local newspapers and any other form of local reporting goes away, people are just not as connected in their community. They don't know what their neighbors are up to. There isn't the reporting about county commission, city council, school board, zoning commission. Who's married, who's gotten married, deaths, births, all those things that bring us together, the glue that holds us together as people. And that was leading to communities, frankly, to people. There were academics doing studies that showed that people were dividing just much more clearly along partisan lines as newspapers faded away. By now, and you know this, David, very well, we've lost something like 2,500 newspapers in this country altogether, plus the downsizing of so many more. We've lost tens of thousands of reporters, and it's all because of the change in the business model, the advertising model. Technology has changed. People can now get their news on their smartphone. They don't have to pay, or their tablet. They don't have to pay to subscribe. And it means local news has taken an enormous hit. And so we went to, and I don't want this answer to go on so long, but
tell them about Canadian, yeah.
Canadian Texas, in the panhandle of Texas. I'll just to condense this. We visited this community where this woman inherited the newspaper from her father, who had picked it up from someone else at the end of World War II. He literally died at his desk, at his job, having been the publisher and editor. She picked it up after he passed away, and she's now over 70 and has given it her all, and she just can't keep it up anymore. So she closed down the newspaper in March of this year, and the community rose up in just in not just disappointment, but they were torn apart over this. We went there, we interviewed ranchers, local business people, people at the church. There was one rancher in particular, a very conservative gentleman, and her editorials had been leaning progressive. He was in tears describing what the Canadian Record had meant for his family. He said, "This is the newspaper that recorded my father's passing. It wrote, you know, they wrote his obituary. It's the paper that covered the wildfire that did so much damage to my ranch, that brought in all these offers of cattle from all over the country. And it's the newspaper that reported on my grandchildren winning being the football, the quarterback at the high school football games." And he cited chapter and verse on what this paper meant, as a reminder that, again, that these are the things that hold communities together. And so we profiled them. We profiled a couple of other news organizations. But it's a reminder that it's something that all of us have to pay attention to.
Al, I would say that the struggles of local newspapers and the demise of them, it not only leads to that division, but also endangers democracy. And I know you're sort of obsessed with the ways that democracy has become so fragile these days, the loss of newspapers, gerrymandering, so many other aspects of that. Can you talk about where you see it?
You're absolutely right, David. I think that these studies that Judy alluded to show a couple things. People vote less when their local newspaper either collapses or becomes a ghost newspaper or is taken over by one of those vultures. Like Alden Capital. And secondly, taxes go up. Why do taxes go up? Because there's no accountability. So therefore, it's easier. It's a terrible loss. And it's just part of this larger picture. Judy did in her series a wonderful long interview with a very conservative former federal judge, Michael Ludig. And Michael Ludig's conservative credentials can be matched against almost anyone. He was the runner-up when they chose Sam Alito. It was a very unfortunate decision. But he has now said that basically looking at January 6th, looking at, I don't know what it is, 35% of the country thinks the last election wasn't real, that's a real threat to democracy, that our whole system is really, really at risk right now. And if we don't address it, we're not going to survive as a thriving democracy. And I think gerrymandering is part of it. I think money in politics is part of it. And I think that I think Trumpism is a huge part of it. And I never worried. I thought some elections might not go the way I would like. But if Ronald Reagan was elected, I didn't really think the country, the system that we know and love, and I didn't think that was in danger. We may have some policies I would disagree with. And I think some of my conservative friends probably felt the same way with Barack Obama. It's different now. And I think in this current election, I really think the fate of democracy is on the ballot, which is a really radical thing to say.
And Judy, that's part of what brought you to Wisconsin for the first story, right? Can you tell us about that?
Because as all of you know very, very well, in that election that you held early this year to fill the vacancy on the state Supreme Court for the Chief Justice, it was the most telling example in the country of how the courts have become the place where these political battles are being fought. It was so often in state legislatures, it certainly was nationally in Congress, but at the state level, it has become increasingly the courts. And we do see it in the federal courts as well, but here you have in Wisconsin, again, I don't have to tell all of you in the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision last year on Roe v. Wade, it became a central issue here in your election. And I know there's now discussion about impeachment of the justice. So we are looking at courts across the country. We are continuing to follow that story because democracy, when you think about it, so many of us take it for granted. I just spent 2 days ago this week in Knoxville, Tennessee, following Danielle Allen, who is a political theorist at Harvard. You, I'm sure, know of her. Many of you, I'm sure, know of her. She has taken upon herself to become one of the chief protagonists, arguing for the recommendations that came out of a commission created by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It worked from 2018 to 2020. At that point, worried about the fate of our democracy. They came out with 31 recommendations, including a constitutional amendment to address money in politics and how the campaign finance laws work, to address the size of the House, the U.S. House of Representatives. They're recommending dramatically increasing that. There are proposals around gerrymandering, around teaching more civics in our schools. This has become a major recommendation. So Danielle Allen is going from school to school, university to university, community to community, talking about, you know, we need to focus on our democracy. We need to go back to the Constitution, to the Declaration of Independence, think about who we are as a country, what our democracy represents, and look at what the threats are today to it. And the Supreme Court, I'll say right now, the U.S. Supreme Court, her recommendation, the Commission's recommendation, is to consider term limits, 18-year term limits, so that justices no longer have a life term, that every president, in effect, would be able to nominate 2 justices, so that you would have, by the time you get to second, third, fourth, fifth president, there would be a complete turnover of the court.
David, can I pick up for a moment on the Wisconsin situation?
Sure.
Because I wrote about it. We had the esteemed Democratic Party chairman. What's his name again? Is he around? I do a podcast with James Carville. And there wasn't anyone in the state that didn't know if one person was selected, the question of abortion would be addressed. If the other person was selected, it wouldn't be. If one person was selected, this incredible, blatantly partisan gerrymandering that you have would be addressed. The other person wouldn't. There was no secret there. And I think what this is a reflection of, the effort to try to impeach someone who hasn't even voted yet, I think it's a reflection of what Trump has brought to the National Party. When you deny an election, I mean, Richard Nixon didn't deny an election in 1960. Go look at Al Gore's eloquent speech in 2000, and you know, when he actually won an election and lost. But when you have people say that elections are frauds, that you can violently attack the Capitol, and that's just a protest, then I think it filters down. And I think I'm sorry, some of the greatest people I've ever known in politics really are Republicans, including Howard Baker, who was at his institute in Tennessee that Judy was this week. But the Republicans under Trump have become the soft on crime party. They don't care. The only criminals they care about are black street guys and Hunter Biden. Everything else, I mean, it's amazing. They went down to the D.C. jail to celebrate the people who beat up cops, and 4 of whom died. And I really do think that that's a message that they've sent down the states, and I think it's most egregious what they're doing here in Wisconsin, but it's happening elsewhere too.
Hunter Biden, who's indicted on gun charges of all things, right? And also maybe vulnerable on taxes. The 2 things the Republicans, they want guns and they hate taxes, exactly. And yet they're going after Hunter Biden. Go back, Judy, just for a second to following Danielle Allen. I just wanted to follow up one bit, which was, how was she received? I mean, it's such a noble enterprise, but was there any reality to it?
It's tough. I mean, she was speaking to a class of freshmen. She did several things over the course of the day at the University of Tennessee. As Al said, it was in the Howard Baker Center, named after this remarkable Republican senator from the state of Tennessee who was known for working across the aisle with Democrats, something we just don't see today. But she was there. She met with a class of freshmen, engaged in them, a lot of questions and answers. She gave a lecture later in the afternoon. We sat down and did an interview with her. She spent time, she's on the board of the I believe it's called the Center for American Civics. I'm not giving the right title.
Close. What's civics? That's what kids would say today. They don't even study it.
And so the here's the other thing, two former Tennessee governors do a podcast together. Governor Bill Haslam, who's a Republican, and Phil Bredesen, who's a Democrat, do a podcast together. Former governors of the state of Tennessee, which is now a state very politically divided, but they talk about issues, they interview people, and they try to model what American politics can be. But you asked how she was received. These students were very interested. Again, these are students who are interested in public policy. There's no question, getting the American people to focus on this, to think about this question of democracy, which I believe we just take it for granted. It's something, I grew up, I didn't think about whether our democracy, as Al said, was at any risk. Today, there's a reason to sit and sit with that and think about it. And so, I think, we've stopped teaching civics in American public schools. That's something that they're very much pushing. There's a whole effort in that direction. There's another separate effort to look at requiring some kind of national service for young people that would be something that the younger generation would accept. None of this is very popular everywhere, so it takes work, and especially things like increasing the size of the House of Representatives. One of the things, David, she does talk a lot about now is doing away with partisan primaries and going to something that she calls all-comers preliminaries, where literally anybody could run from any political party. I know the parties may not love the idea right now, but her rationale is that as long as our parties are driving the primary process, the candidates we get tend to be people who come farther to the right, farther from the left. We are losing that essential center in American politics, and we need to find a way to restore it.
Al, you talked about your Republicans that you admire. I know you've had a lot of close friends who are conservatives, including the Prince of Darkness himself, Bob Novak. But from your perspective, what happened to the Republican Party?
Well, I think that it really started under Gingrich, and I think Gingrich turned politics into warfare. Everything was warfare. Look, politics, was it Mr. Dooley said it ain't beanbag? Someone said it. And people fought with intensity about big issues, civil rights, and the size of government and entitlements. But there was a certain comity to it. Ted Kennedy was the classic example, who worked with the Howard Bakers of the world. Gingrich came in and said, no, this is a war. We hate these people. They're our enemies. And he built, he was a very successful guerrilla warrior. He took over the House. He was a terrible speaker. They threw him out. But he set that tone, and it was there, and you saw in the Tea Party, and then Trump took it over. And Trump has, and if Trump either is defeated in the primary, is in jail, or goes away, Trumpism lives, and it lives big in state after state. And the state of Michigan, they basically had a huge fight over party leadership, and it was the MAGA people who were the moderates. They were they were beaten by the super MAGA people. And when I say that, it's just not MAGA is not just a term, it's what they believe in. They believe in an authoritarian government. And I do think it's a danger. I think there still are a lot of good Republicans, but you're losing them. Yeah, Mitt Romney was a classic example. Let me give you one more. One of the people I really admired in politics, I disagreed with him on a number of things, was Jack Kemp. Because Jack Kemp believed in broadening the appeal of the party, and he believed in including everyone, and was great on racial issues. And if Jack had lived, there was a congressman elected from Ohio in 2016, Anthony Gonzalez, who would have been Jack Kemp's role model. He was a Ohio State football player. He played for the San Francisco 49ers. He got an MBA from Stanford. His parents were Cuban immigrants from Cuba. He started a successful small business and was elected to the House of Representatives. I mean, boy, you couldn't ask for anything better, right? And guess what? Donald Trump drove him out of politics. He couldn't run again. His family got insulted because Trump attacked him. And that's what's happening, David. And it's very, I think I think it's a lot different than it was just 15 or 20 years ago.
As someone who studied Newt Gingrich, I agree completely with you.
Well,
he's the godfather.
It's called, I think, Shut
Trump.
Up, Newt Gingrich.
Yeah. Tell Newt to shut up, yeah. Judy, getting back to the crossroads, I know that you spent time with, sometimes polls can be sort of boring or expected, right? But the polls that you studied with the Pew Research Foundation were really fascinating in terms of explaining the divide. Can you go through that?
Yeah, I mean, they really were the foundation of our work. We decided in the very beginning, back in January, even before that we wanted to look at the deep research that the Pew Research Center, based in DC, has done over time, looking at just what Americans believe and how divided we are. And it really was the genesis for this project, because what they understand, what they've proven with their surveys, and they're probably the most respected polling organization in the country, if not one of the most, if not the most, is that Americans 30 years ago, I'm going to hold my hands up, were this far apart. Today, we are this far apart. They looked at a series that they went down a list of issues from the role of government in American life, to abortion, to just naming issues. And on every single issue, some much more than others, Americans are much farther apart. But here's the thing that was so telling for us, that not only are Americans farther apart, but the view of members of each party about people in the other party is today much darker than it was 25, 30 years ago. And they documented this, that, for example, they asked, and they asked both Democrats and Republicans, what do you think? Do you think, what's your view of whether the other members of the other party are lazy, dishonest, un-American, those kinds of questions? And in every one of those categories, Democrats had darker views of Republicans, and Republicans, this is telling too, had even worse views of Democrats, particularly on questions like, do you think members of the other party are dishonest? Something like it. The number shot up from 30-something% to almost 75% of Republicans think Democrats are dishonest. So you not only have a difference, but you have this just view that the other side is they're not just mistaken or misinformed, that there's something wrong with them. And so today you see this uglier language. It's why I think we have families that can't even get together over Thanksgiving dinner. We have families that are where it's tense. If we get together, we're not gonna talk about politics. Maybe they didn't talk a lot about politics before, but today you stay 100 miles away from it. And then we also, I'll just add quickly, David, we spoke with a researcher. She was at, she's now at Johns Hopkins, or no, she was at Johns Hopkins, now she's at the University of Maryland. Her name is Liliana Mason. And in her work, she has pinpointed how Americans have taken on, where you used to identify yourself by what church you go to, where you grew up, what kind of books you read, where you live to some extent. Today, so much more of our identity, she discovered, is wrapped around what political party we belong to. We identify as an R or a D. We want to live around other Republicans or Democrats who are our kind of people. And we are separating. And in many respects, Americans are moving. Not everywhere, but in many places, Americans are moving to be near people who agree with them politically. It's not healthy for our democracy. I mean, we are much healthier as a country if we're a mosaic and if we can get along with each other. And if we aren't so far apart that we can't even figure out a way to solve the questions that determine the future of this country. And look at what's happening in Congress. right now. And you see it, I mean, we've seen it not just this year, but years to come. And we can talk a lot about it, but that's where the American people are. We are now emulating what many of our politicians have demonstrated is how they get along with each other.
Al, I don't know if you agree with this, but I always look at what's going on in this country and see at the gut of it all is race. That so many of these issues, including voting rights, voter repression, the response, Trump as a response to Obama, that when you get underneath it, race is always there.
Race is omnipresent, always has been. I don't think, unfortunately, I thought it would begin to change under Obama, and it changed for Obama, but not, under Obama. But I think it's also broader. I think that, look, the Republicans have conned. They've conned people. They've conned particularly people who are struggling. But there's a sense in some of these communities, too. I went to a Western Pennsylvania community that Senator Casey said was a perfect place to go to, Maraniss in Pennsylvania. And this was in 2016. And I understood why they were voting for Trump. They were wrong, I thought, but I understood. And one guy said to me, he said, let me ask you a question. I said, yeah. He said, how you doing after the Depression? They thought 08, 09 was a depression. I said, well, we're doing fine. And how are all your pals in Congress doing? I said, well, I think, most. And how about all those fat cats in Wall Street that caused this goddamn thing? And I said, well, I guess they're. And he said, but you know who's not doing good? We're not doing good. We got screwed. He used a stronger term. And he was bitter. And you know something? He was right. He was absolutely right. And I think there is, unfortunately, I think some Democrats, certainly not all, maybe not even most, there's been a certain elitism. They convey a certain elitism about those people. And I haven't, we talked to Chris Murphy on our podcast last week, and he got mad at some of his liberal colleagues who immediately trashed that song that's gone viral, Richmond, north of Richmond. Because he said, if you look at the things he said in the song that he says are not, but he's talking about the plight of working class people. And he said, we should embrace some of that. So I defer to very few in my contempt for Trumpism and everything it stands for, but I think some of the problem goes beyond race, though that's central always, David.
The songwriter himself says it's been adopted by the right wing, but he didn't write it for that reason.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Judy, I want to sort of get back to the nitty-gritty of your life at PBS. So through COVID, I would always look at the books on your bookshelf, right? They were mostly Civil War books. You were pretty careful about which ones you'd put there, probably. But tell us, what was it like to spend a year, in your apartment, broadcasting the news?
Well, it was something I never thought I would be doing, that's for sure. Al and I live in a condominium on the 10th floor of a building in Washington, D.C., and I never thought I would be anchoring the news from there, but that's exactly what happened. The country shut down, all of us shut down, and the NewsHour studio shut down because we couldn't be together, and we scrambled over the course. I continued to anchor, I think, for about 2 weeks after the shutdown. They dramatically reduced the number of people who could come into the studio. I think we were down to one camera person, one lighting person, and then 2 or 3 people in the control room and me. And at that point, we didn't know whether masks were the right thing or not, and we were all trying to figure out what we should do, washing our hands all the time. But after they took those 2 weeks to scramble and set up, rig a camera, lighting, and computer set up at my home in the library. And so Al, who had been working part of the time at home, suddenly had a lot of company. His wife was there all day long.
You didn't kick him out?
I had to be very quiet.
He had to be very quiet. He would heating up his coffee often as we were going on the air at 6 o'clock. The microwave would slam shut, And I'd say, Al, I'm on the air for the news hour. Right around the corner.
Can I just say one thing, though? She did not line up those books. The books were there until about 9 months into it. One of her producers said, "We have to mix up these books." And one of the books
Ron
that was
Chernow
was Ron Chernow's fabulous book on Grant. I mean, if you haven't read it, Ulysses S. Grant was a great general, and B, a pretty darn good president. And Ron captured that, and he was very appreciative.
That book was right behind me.
Yeah, I know.
And I got more comments. Finally, Chernow himself wrote in and said, and at one point a producer said, well, we need to mix it up. And when I moved it, I started hearing from viewers, why have you, what happened? What happened to the...
Chernow gets Judy Woodruff. I get Adam Schefter of NFL reports or whatever.
But to answer your question, who would have ever believed that we could scramble and do? But we did, and it was with the help with an amazing group of technical people.
Were they there all day? I mean,
what'd you say?
Were they there all day in your apartment?
Well, they spent nonstop, as I said, I think about 2 weeks setting it up, rigging up. And we spent a lot of time with Verizon, the telephone company, making sure we had the bandwidth to send out a live television signal. And believe it or not, we were able to broadcast from home for over a year without any major glitches. I mean, there were storms that came through Washington. There were days when, nights when we were doing live news, not to mention January the 6th, where I was on the air from, I'm leaving out the election night. I mean, I anchored election night from there, the entire, that entire presidential election season. We did go into the studio with heavily distanced and masked to cover the conventions, because as you remember, the conventions were, for us, they were remote. We didn't go. And we went into the studio.
Milwaukee remembers.
I sat about 12 feet from Amy Walter. She was my only guest at the desk. But otherwise, it was the election night. And then, as I say, January the 6th, where we went on the air at 10 o'clock in the morning thinking we were going to cover this routine passing of certifying of the election. And it turned into what you saw. And we were on the air till 10 or 11 o'clock straight through that entire day. PBS carried it live. I'll never forget it as long as I
Is there any difference in how the producers and directors deal with you when you're at home? For that day, so much information was coming in.
Not in my ear, but so much. I mean, I'm now wed to Zoom and something we call Microsoft Teams. You probably all use it in your work. It's email, it's texting. I mean, I'm constantly checking my iPhone for texting. I don't have a chance to look at
even when you're driving.
When you're live. But we had to step up the game, and I think we all now look back on it and think, well, we did what we had to do. But if you had told us a few months ahead of time that we were going to be broadcasting a national news program during a pandemic, the most contested election in modern history that would turn out to be denied by Donald Trump, I would have said you were crazy. But somehow we did it, and I give all the tribute to my colleagues at the NewsHour. They were simply remarkable because I was able to rely on them day after day, night after night, to get that program on the air. And with the presence of one technician. I mean, one technician would come in, push a button and plug something in, and I was on live and turn on the lights, and that was it. I will say this, David, that a little more than a year in, it seemed like COVID was receding. It was 2021. So I said, okay, I'm going to go back to the studio. We can all be masked, but I just feel like I've crowded and cramped Al's style long enough, and I'm tired of hearing the microwave door close. But I went back to the studio, and then along came the Delta wave of COVID. But I stayed in the studio. We did a very, again, scaled-down version with just a couple of people in the studio. And then by the next year, it seems like ancient history, 2022, I was still in the studio, and of course more COVID, but then it's receded. But I have to say, I am the luckiest person in American television. I was able to turn the program over to the incredible anchor team of Amna Nawaz and Jeff Bennett, who are anchoring it brilliantly today. They deserve a hand.
Al, other than closing the microwave, where were you on January 6th, and how did you respond to that?
I was home trying to be quiet, and I was just stunned. I mean, I covered the Congress for 11 years, and I think the Capitol is a citadel. It is just, to me, I think it's the most majestic building in Washington, far more so than the White House, and it really is. There's so much wonderful history to it. And I couldn't believe this was occurring. And David, there was a juxtaposition. I think one of the most memorable moments of my life was July 27th, 1974. I was covering impeachment in the House. I was covering impeachment. I didn't cover Watergate per se, but I covered the politics of Watergate once it got to the Congress. And July 27th was a Saturday night, and I was covering the House Committee on Judiciary, and they voted the first bill of impeachment against the president in 106 years. And about 7:30 at night, I left, and I walked from the Rayburn office building over to the Capitol. And there on the Capitol steps on a Saturday night were some tourists. There was someone actually playing an instrument. There were police there. You let cars go by then, and the American flag was flying. And I thought, my God, this is a great country. I mean, something really, really traumatic has happened, and we're going on as we should go on. And to juxtapose that with what happened on January 6th, I was watching on television, and I was just like all of you. I was horrified.
One last question about the two of you. Al, you're sort of the opinion guy, and Judy's the news person. But how do you feed off each other, and what do you learn from each other in your daily existence about what each of you are doing?
Me or you?
I mean, I could start and just say that, people ask me, a lot, what's it like being married to another journalist? And it takes another journalist to understand the peculiar highs and lows and ups and downs of journalism. You have the greatest day in the world when you feel like you've done a good story, you've broken some news, or you've understood something, you've been able to convey something, and the story worked, and you're riding high. The next day, you didn't get the interview, you got something wrong, God forbid, you spelled something wrong, and it's like this, and it takes another journalist to understand that. Having said that, working in television is different, broadcasting from working in print. So I think, we've complemented each other that way. We generally have not competed against each other. There are a couple of exceptions to that, and I'll just share one of them. We have not competed, except during the Reagan administration. I was covering the White House. This was 1981, and Reagan liked to take those long vacations in Santa Barbara. So we pooled together the money, his expense account from the Wall Street Journal and my little expense account from NBC for 6 hotel room nights in Santa Barbara. And we thought, well, we'll rent a small house that we can stay in. And so we rented this house for the week. And Al, unbeknownst to me, had been working on a story with Reagan's budget director, David Stockman, to talk to him throughout the budget process, off the record, after which Al would publish. I'm sorry.
On background.
On background. Yeah, on background. Meaning he could use it later, but he was going to hold all that until after the budget deal was worked out. I was, meanwhile, desperately trying to get an interview with David Stockman. I was calling his office. I was, and just getting nowhere. So there I am in the house, and one day the phone rings. I pick it up, and it's David Stockman. I said, "Oh, Mr. Director, it's great to hear you." He said, "Hi, Judy. Is Al there?" And I very reluctantly, I said, "I hope I can get an interview with you at some point, but yes."
Oh, gosh.
He's here. So then Al shut the door. This is before the days of cell phones. Al went into a room, shut the door, and talked to him. But fortunately, those were few and far.
Well, I will just say that in recent years, when we travel together, it is really remarkable the number of people that brush by me and come up to talk to Judy Woodruff. And we did an event, exactly, yeah. We did event together a few weeks ago, and they said it's so nice to have a couple here. And I said, tell you what it reminds me of. I don't know, was anyone around in Milwaukee when the Braves were still here?
Yes.
I said, you know what we are? We are the equivalent of the greatest home run hitters in baseball, the Aaron brothers. They hit 768. Henry hit 755. Tommy hit 13. I'm Tommy.
I used that same metaphor once, and my wife said, nobody knows what you're talking about. But this crowd does know.
It works in Wisconsin, right?
Well, thank you so much, both of you. It's been delightful to talk to you for this hour. And
what a privilege. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much for coming. David, I'll say one more thing. I bought this notebook today. I had no intentions of opening it, but I thought I could pander to the crowd. So I